December 26, 1943. The Arctic waters churned black and merciless beneath a sky that hadn't seen daylight in weeks. Somewhere in those frozen depths, the most powerful battlecruiser in Hitler's Kriegsmarine was about to face its reckoning. But this story doesn't begin with the thunder of naval guns or the screaming of men drowning in icy darkness. It begins 6 months earlier in a wood-paneled conference room in London, where a single dismissive comment would ignite a fury that would echo across the Atlantic and into the pages of military history forever. General Dwight Eisenhower stood at the head of the table, his jaw set firm as he reviewed deployment orders for Operation Overlord. Around him sat the Allied High Command, maps sprawled across mahogany surfaces like the scattered pieces of a deadly puzzle. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of millions. When the topic of naval support came up, a Canadian liaison officer cleared his throat and suggested that the Royal Canadian Navy could provide crucial escort and screening operations for the invasion force. What happened next would become the spark that lit an inferno. Eisenhower, never one to mince words but usually diplomatic, let slip a comment that cut deeper than any German blade. He suggested, with barely concealed skepticism, that the Canadian Navy was barely fit for coastal patrol, let alone the largest amphibious operation in human history. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Several British officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Canadian liaison, a young commander named Harrison, felt his face burn crimson, not from embarrassment but from pure, undiluted rage. But Eisenhower wasn't finished. He continued, explaining with clinical precision that while Canadian ground forces had proven themselves capable, their navy was an afterthought, a collection of corvettes and destroyers that would be better suited protecting fishing vessels than spearheading the liberation of Europe. He didn't say these words with malice. That was almost worse. He said them with the casual certainty of stating an obvious fact, like commenting on the weather or noting the color of the sky. Word spread through the Canadian military establishment like wildfire through dry timber. From Halifax to Vancouver, from the smallest corvette to the headquarters of the Royal Canadian Navy, officers and sailors heard what Eisenhower had said. Some laughed bitterly. Others cursed. But one man, sitting in his office reviewing intelligence reports on German naval movements in the Arctic, simply smiled. A cold, predatory smile that would have made a great white shark uncomfortable. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds was not a man who forgot insults. More importantly, he was not a man who let them go unanswered. At 40 years old, Simonds had already earned a reputation as one of the most brilliant and ruthless tactical minds in the Allied forces. Methodical. Calculating. Absolutely merciless when he identified a weakness in enemy defenses. But what most people didn't know about Simonds was that before he had risen through the army ranks, he had spent 2 years training with the Royal Navy. He understood naval warfare with an intimacy that few army officers could match. As Simonds sat in his office that June evening, reading and rereading the intelligence reports, a plan began to form. A plan so audacious, so precisely calculated in its brutality, that it would either cement his legacy as a military genius or destroy his career entirely. The target was already chosen for him by fate and German naval strategy. The Scharnhorst, one of Hitler's prized battlecruisers, had been wreaking havoc on Allied Arctic convoys for months. Fast, heavily armed, and commanded by one of Germany's most experienced naval officers, the ship was a constant thorn in the side of Allied supply operations to the Soviet Union. The British Admiralty had been trying to corner the Scharnhorst for over a year, but the massive warship always managed to slip away into the frozen darkness of the Arctic winter. Its captain, Contra-Admiral Eric Bay, was a master of hit-and-run tactics, striking convoy escorts with devastating precision before vanishing into snowstorms and the endless polar night. British battleships were too slow. Destroyers were too lightly armed. Aircraft carriers couldn't operate effectively in the extreme weather conditions. The Scharnhorst seemed invincible, untouchable, a ghost ship that appeared only to kill and then disappeared like smoke. Simonds saw something that everyone else had missed. He saw a pattern in the Scharnhorst's attacks. A rhythm. A predictability masked by apparent randomness. More importantly, he saw an opportunity. The next major Arctic convoy, codenamed JW-55B, was scheduled to depart from Scotland on December 20th. If Simonds was right about his analysis of German naval patterns, the Scharnhorst would attack on December 26th, Boxing Day. It was almost poetic in a dark and terrible way. But here was the genius, the absolute brilliance of what Simonds proposed. He didn't want to just defend the convoy. He didn't want to drive the Scharnhorst away. He wanted to destroy it completely, utterly, with such overwhelming force that it would send shockwaves through the German naval command and, more importantly, prove to Eisenhower and every other doubter that the Canadian Navy was anything but an afterthought. The plan Simonds presented to the Canadian naval staff in late October was so complex, so dependent on perfect timing and coordination, that several senior officers thought he had lost his mind. It required Canadian destroyers to act as bait, deliberately exposing themselves to the Scharnhorst's massive guns. It required positioning multiple task forces in the Arctic darkness with such precision that a miscalculation of even a few miles would result in disaster. It required naval gunnery accuracy in conditions that made normal combat operations almost impossible. Most dangerously, it required convincing the British Admiralty to let a Canadian officer coordinate a major naval operation involving British capital ships. That last part nearly killed the plan before it even started. The British were protective of their naval prestige, understandably so given that the Royal Navy had been the world's dominant sea power for centuries. The idea of letting a Canadian Army general dictate naval tactics was, to put it mildly, unprecedented. Several admirals laughed outright when the proposal reached their desks. One famously said that he would rather kiss Adolf Hitler on the lips than take tactical orders from a colonial army officer. But Simonds had an ace up his sleeve. He had the intelligence. Weeks of painstaking analysis, cross-referenced reports from Norwegian resistance fighters, decrypted German communications, weather pattern predictions, and a mathematical model of the Scharnhorst's operational patterns that was so detailed it could predict the ship's location within a 20-mile radius. When Simonds presented this information to Admiral Bruce Fraser, the commander-in-chief of the British Home Fleet, the room went silent. Fraser, a sharp-minded officer who valued results over protocol, studied the data for nearly an hour without saying a word. Then he looked up at Simonds and asked a single question. "If I give you tactical command of this operation, can you guarantee results?" Simonds didn't hesitate. "I can guarantee the Scharnhorst will be at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean by December 27th. Fraser smiled, a rare expression for a man known for his stern demeanor. "Then let's show these Germans what happens when they underestimate the colonies." The pieces began moving into place with the precision of a master chess game. The convoy JW-55B departed Scotland right on schedule, 19 merchant ships carrying vital supplies to the Soviet port of Murmansk. To any German observer, it looked like a standard convoy operation, protected by the usual escort of destroyers and corvettes. But beneath this ordinary appearance, something extraordinary was being orchestrated. 400 miles away, in different positions calculated down to the exact nautical mile, 3 separate naval task forces waited in the polar darkness. Admiral Fraser's flagship, the battleship Duke of York, accompanied by the cruiser Jamaica and 4 destroyers, held position to the southwest. A second force of cruisers Sheffield, Norfolk and Belfast maintained station to the north. And here, in the most dangerous position of all, were the Canadian destroyers Haida, Huron, and Iroquois, positioned directly between the convoy and the most likely approach vector for the Scharnhorst. The Canadian crews knew they were the bait. They knew that when the Scharnhorst appeared, its 11-inch guns would target them first. They knew their thin armor plating would offer about as much protection as tissue paper against shells the size of small automobiles. They knew all of this and they volunteered anyway. Because every single man on those ships had heard what Eisenhower said about the Canadian Navy. Every single sailor wanted to prove him catastrophically wrong. December 24th came and went. Christmas Day arrived with howling winds and temperatures that made exposed skin freeze in seconds. The convoy plowed eastward through heavy seas, the merchant ships struggling to maintain formation in conditions that would have turned back any peacetime vessel. On the bridge of HMCS Haida, Commander Harry de Wolf stood watch, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the enemy. De Wolf was a legend in the Canadian Navy, a fighting captain who had already sunk more enemy vessels than any other Canadian commander. He chain-smoked through the long Arctic night, burning through pack after pack of cigarettes as the tension mounted. In Alton Fjord, Norway, the Scharnhorst sat at anchor, its crew preparing for what they believed would be another successful convoy raid. Conter-Admiral Bay was confident. His ship was fast, his crew experienced, his tactical doctrine proven through dozens of successful operations. German intelligence had reported the convoy's position accurately, and Bay calculated that a quick strike on Boxing Day would catch the escorts off guard, allow him to sink several merchant ships, and get back to port before British capital ships could respond. It was a plan he had executed successfully many times before. What Bay didn't know was that Simonds had predicted his every move. What he didn't know was that every position he planned to attack from had been anticipated, calculated, and turned into a killing zone. What he didn't know was that the seemingly weak Canadian destroyers weren't running from a fight, they were leading him into the most sophisticated naval ambush ever conceived. December 26, 0400 hours. The Scharnhorst left Altenfjord, its massive screws churning the black water into phosphorescent foam. The battlecruiser was a monster of steel and firepower, over 770 feet long, displacing 38,000 tons, capable of speeds exceeding 31 knots. Its main battery consisted of 9 11-inch guns that could hurl a shell over 12 miles with devastating accuracy. Its crew of nearly 2,000 men was among the best trained in the Kriegsmarine. On paper, the Scharnhorst was virtually unstoppable. 0840 hours. The first radar contact came from the British cruiser Belfast. A large surface contact, bearing 020 degrees, speed 25 knots, heading directly toward the convoy. The contact could only be one thing. The trap was sprung, but now came the most dangerous part. The Canadian destroyers had to engage first, had to draw the Scharnhorst's attention, had to make the German captain commit to a course of action that would seal his fate. De Wolf on the Haida received his orders. Engage and harass. Make the Scharnhorst chase. Let it into the killing zone. The Canadian destroyers surged forward through mountainous seas, their crews at battle stations, every man knowing that in minutes they would be under fire from guns that could obliterate them with a single direct hit. The distance closed rapidly. 10 miles. 8 miles. 6 miles. At 0930 hours, the Scharnhorst opened fire. The sound of those first salvos was like the end of the world. Massive shells screamed through the darkness, their passage creating shock waves that could be felt on the bridge. Waterspouts erupted around the Canadian ships, towering columns of water and ice that crashed down on decks with crushing force. The Scharnhorst's gunnery was terrifyingly accurate. A shell passed so close to the Haida's bridge that De Wolf could feel the heat of its passage on his face. Another struck the water just yards from the Huron's stern, the explosion lifting the destroyer's rear out of the water and slamming it back down with bone-jarring force. But the Canadian ships didn't run. They returned fire with their smaller guns, not expecting to damage the battlecruiser but keeping up a harassing attack that forced the Scharnhorst to maneuver, to turn, to follow. De Wolf's destroyers zigzagged through the shell impacts, every course change precisely calculated to draw the German ship further into Simonds's trap. Sailors on the Haida's deck watched shells the size of telephone poles streak overhead, knowing that any one of them could end their lives in an instant of fire and shrapnel. Bay on the Scharnhorst was furious. These Canadian destroyers should have been running, should have been trying to escape. Instead, they were attacking, their gunfire inaccurate but persistent, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested tactical sophistication far beyond what he had expected. Something was wrong. Every instinct Bay had developed over decades of naval combat was screaming at him to break off, to turn back, to return to the safety of Norwegian waters. But pride is a terrible master. Bay had reported to his superiors that he would destroy this convoy. He had his reputation as an unstoppable commerce raider to maintain. German propaganda had made the Scharnhorst into a symbol of naval invincibility. How would it look if he ran from a few Canadian destroyers? The decision to continue the engagement took perhaps 30 seconds to make. Those 30 seconds sealed the fate of everyone aboard the battlecruiser. 1,215 hours. The cruisers Sheffield, Norfolk, and Belfast emerged from the northern darkness. The Scharnhorst's radar operators detected them almost immediately, and Bay realized with dawning horror that he had been led into an ambush. He ordered maximum speed, trying to break away from the engagement, but the British cruisers were already in firing position. The Norfolk's 8-inch guns opened fire first, shells bracketing the Scharnhorst with terrifying precision. The Sheffield and Belfast joined in moments later, creating a wall of steel and explosives that the German battlecruiser had to navigate through. The Scharnhorst's armor was thick, designed to withstand punishment, and the cruiser's shells, while damaging, weren't enough to penetrate vital areas. But they didn't need to. Every hit was slowing the ship down, disrupting systems, causing casualties. More critically, every minute the cruisers kept the Scharnhorst engaged was a minute that allowed the real hammer to fall. Admiral Fraser on the Duke of York had been racing north at maximum speed since the first contact report. The British battleship was closing the distance with mathematical precision, its crew at action stations, its 14-inch guns loaded and ready. At 1,617 hours, the Duke of York's radar locked onto the Scharnhorst from 45,000 yards, over 22 miles away. Fraser gave the order to open fire. The Duke of York's broadside was apocalyptic. 10 14-inch guns firing simultaneously created a shockwave that could be felt miles away. Sailors on the nearby destroyers said later that it was like watching a volcano erupt horizontally. The shells took nearly a minute to reach their target, arcing through the darkness in trajectories calculated by the most advanced fire control computers available. When they arrived with the force of meteors. The first salvo straddled the Scharnhorst, shells landing in perfect bracket formation on either side of the battlecruiser. The second salvo found the range. A 14-inch shell struck the Scharnhorst's forward turret, the explosion ripping through armor plate like it was cardboard, killing everyone inside instantly and jamming the turret in place. Another shell penetrated the engine room, the blast destroying one of the boilers and reducing the ship's maximum speed by nearly a third. Bay knew he was finished. The Scharnhorst was now caught between the Duke of York to the south and the cruisers to the north, with Canadian destroyers harassing from the west. His ship was damaged, slowing and facing overwhelming firepower. He could surrender and save his crew, or he could fight to the end. For a German naval officer in 1943, with the whole weight of Nazi ideology and military tradition pressing down on him, there was really only one choice. The Scharnhorst turned to face the Duke of York, its remaining guns blazing defiance. For the next hour, the two battleships exchanged fire in one of the most ferocious surface actions of the war. The Scharnhorst's gunnery was brilliant, despite the damage and mounting casualties. Several shells hit the Duke of York, one penetrating the hull and causing flooding in 3 compartments. But Fraser's ship had the advantage of numbers, of undamaged systems, of a crew that was fresh and alert while the Germans were exhausted and desperate. At 18:20 hours, a salvo from the Duke of York achieved what naval historians would later call the perfect solution. Multiple 14-inch shells struck the Scharnhorst's central citadel simultaneously, penetrating to the magazines and machinery spaces. The explosions were catastrophic. The battlecruiser's speed dropped to less than 5 knots, fires raging across multiple decks, listing heavily to starboard. But here is where Simons's plan reached its terrible climax. The wounded Scharnhorst was not allowed to simply sink. The Canadian destroyers, the same ships that had been used as bait, that had been nearly destroyed in the opening engagement, now closed for the kill. De Wolf on the Haida led the attack, his destroyers launching torpedoes from point-blank range. The Norwegians in their London exile had provided detailed blueprints of the Scharnhorst's construction. Simonds had studied those blueprints for weeks, identifying the exact points where torpedo hits would do maximum damage. The Canadian torpedoes struck with surgical precision. One hit the starboard engine room, another breached the hull below the waterline amidships, a third struck the stern near the rudder. The Scharnhorst was dying, but it was dying slowly, and Simonds had ordered that the ship be given no mercy, no chance to surrender, no opportunity for its crew to escape. This was not just about sinking a ship. This was about sending a message. The British destroyers joined the attack. More torpedoes. More shells. The Scharnhorst was now a floating wreck, its guns silent, its speed gone, its crew fighting fires and flooding in a losing battle against physics and the freezing Arctic water. Bay, standing on what remained of his bridge, watched his command die around him. Reports came in of compartments flooding, of men trapped below decks, of systems failing one after another. The water temperature was below freezing. Anyone who went into the sea would be dead within minutes. At 1945 hours, nearly 12 hours after leaving Altenfjord, the Scharnhorst rolled over and sank. The battlecruiser went down bow first, its stern rising into the air like a monument to German naval ambition before sliding beneath the black water. Of the nearly 2,000 men aboard, only 36 survived. Bay was not among them. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Destroyers searched the freezing water for survivors, pulling men from the sea in a desperate race against hypothermia. Most of the survivors were incoherent, suffering from extreme cold and shock. Several died within hours despite the best efforts of medical personnel. The Arctic Ocean had claimed another sacrifice, and this time it was a sacrifice that would reshape naval doctrine and international military perception. When news of the Scharnhorst's destruction reached London, the reaction was euphoric. Churchill personally called Admiral Fraser to offer congratulations. King George VI sent a telegram praising the victory. The British press went wild with headlines about the triumph over German naval power. But here is what made this victory different from every other naval engagement of the war. When the detailed after-action reports were compiled, when the tactical analysis was completed, when senior naval officers studied exactly how the Scharnhorst had been lured into an ambush and systematically destroyed, one name appeared over and over again in the planning documents. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. An Army officer. A Canadian. The report that landed on Eisenhower's desk in early January 1944 was devastating in its precision. It outlined in clinical detail how Simonds had predicted the Scharnhorst's movements weeks in advance, how he had positioned forces with mathematical accuracy, how he had used Canadian destroyers as bait to draw the German battlecruiser into a killing zone, and how the entire operation had resulted in the destruction of one of Germany's most powerful warships with minimal Allied casualties. There was a handwritten note attached to the report from Admiral Fraser. It read simply, "The Canadian Navy has just demonstrated tactical sophistication and operational courage that rivals the finest traditions of the Royal Navy. I suggest we reconsider any assumptions about colonial naval capabilities." Eisenhower sat in his office reading and rereading the report. His staff said later that he looked like a man who had just been punched in the stomach. He called for the Canadian liaison officer, the same Commander Harrison who had been in the room 6 months earlier when Eisenhower had made his dismissive comments about the Royal Canadian Navy. The conversation that followed was brief. Eisenhower apologized. Fully, completely, without reservation. He acknowledged that his earlier assessment had been wrong, that he had allowed prejudice and incomplete information to cloud his judgment. More importantly, he immediately revised the naval support plans for Operation Overlord to include significantly expanded roles for Canadian naval forces. The Royal Canadian Navy would play crucial roles in the D-Day landings, not as an afterthought, but as full and equal partners in the greatest amphibious operation in history. But the story doesn't end there because the Boxing Day Massacre, as it came to be known, had ripple effects that extended far beyond a single naval engagement. When word spread through the Canadian military about what had happened, about how Simonds had planned and executed the destruction of the Scharnhorst specifically to prove Eisenhower wrong, morale skyrocketed to levels that Canadian military historians said had never been seen before or since. Recruitment for the Royal Canadian Navy increased by over 300% in the 3 months following the engagement. Young men who had been planning to join the Army or Air Force suddenly wanted to serve on the ships that had humiliated one of Hitler's prized battlecruisers. Training programs were expanded, new vessels were commissioned, and the Canadian naval presence in the Atlantic and Arctic theaters grew exponentially. More subtle but equally important were the changes in how Allied commanders viewed Canadian forces. The old condescending attitudes, the casual dismissals, the assumption that colonial troops were second-rate, all of that evaporated almost overnight. Canadian ground forces in Italy reported that British and American units that had previously been standoffish or dismissive suddenly became respectful, even deferential. Canadian airmen flying bomber missions over Germany found themselves welcomed into British and American units as equals rather than as colonial auxiliaries. Simonds himself became a legend. His tactical manual on combined arms operations became required reading at military academies across the Allied nations. His methods of intelligence analysis and operational planning were studied and copied by commanders in every theater of the war. When Simonds was promoted to Corps Command for the Northwest Europe campaign, seasoned British and American generals who had decades more experience didn't protest. They acknowledged that he had earned the position through demonstrated brilliance. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. The Canadian military, and by extension the Canadian nation, had spent decades operating in the shadow of British and American power. There was always an undercurrent of inferiority, a sense that Canada was playing a supporting role in the great drama of world events. The Boxing Day Massacre shattered that perception. It proved that Canadian forces, when properly led and equipped, could match or exceed the performance of any military in the world. There's a photograph that captures the essence of this transformation. It was taken in June 1944 on the beaches of Normandy, the day after D-Day. In the foreground is HMCS Haida, de Wolf's destroyer, its guns silent now, its crew exhausted but triumphant. In the background, clearly visible through the smoke of battle, is the invasion fleet, thousands of ships stretching to the horizon. And somewhere in that fleet is the Duke of York Admiral Fraser's flagship. The two ships, Canadian and British, that had worked together to destroy the Scharnhorst, now working together to liberate Europe. The photograph ran in newspapers across Canada with a caption that said simply, "The fleet that Hitler feared." No mention of colonies. No mention of supporting roles. Just a recognition that Canadian naval forces had earned their place at the table of military greatness. De Wolf kept a personal journal throughout the war, and in it he recorded his thoughts on the night after the Scharnhorst sank. He wrote, "We proved something today that goes beyond tactics or strategy. We proved that courage and skill are not the exclusive property of any nation or empire. We proved that underestimation is the gravest error a military commander can make. And we proved that sometimes, the greatest victories come not from following established doctrine, but from the sheer refusal to accept someone else's judgment of your worth. That last line resonates across the decades. Because the Boxing Day Massacre was never really about sinking a ship. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about a group of men who refused to accept being dismissed and belittled, who turned insult into motivation, who channeled their anger into the kind of focused, disciplined excellence that achieves the impossible. The German reaction to the loss of the Scharnhorst was catastrophic for naval morale. Hitler, already deeply suspicious of his surface fleet, became even more convinced that capital ships were useless. He ordered remaining battleships to remain in port, essentially ceding control of the North Atlantic to Allied forces. U-boat commanders reported decreased support and resources as Hitler redirected naval priorities. The psychological impact of losing the Scharnhorst to what German propaganda had dismissed as inferior colonial forces was devastating. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine, wrote in his personal diary that the Scharnhorst's loss represented a turning point in German naval strategy. Not because of the tactical defeat itself, but because of who had achieved it. If Canadian forces could execute such sophisticated operations, Donitz reasoned, then the entire Allied military structure was far more capable than German intelligence had assessed. This led to a wholesale re-evaluation of enemy capabilities that contributed to increasingly conservative German naval doctrine in the final years of the war. Back in Canada, the impact was transformational. The country had contributed significantly to the war effort since 1939, but the Boxing Day Massacre represented something different. It was a purely Canadian achievement, planned and executed by Canadian officers, using Canadian tactical innovation. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, usually cautious in his rhetoric, gave a radio address to the nation in which he declared that Canada had proven itself not just as a contributor to Allied victory, but as a military power in its own right. The speech resonated deeply with a population that had sent hundreds of thousands of young men and women overseas to fight. Families who had sons and daughters in uniform felt a surge of pride that went beyond the usual wartime patriotism. This was validation. This was proof that their sacrifices mattered, that Canadian forces were making a difference, that their nation stood as an equal among the great powers. Simonds, characteristically, deflected the attention. In his only press interview about the operation, he emphasized the role of the Canadian destroyer crews, the British capital ships, and the intelligence analysts who had made the operation possible. He refused to take personal credit, insisting that modern warfare was a team effort where individual glory was meaningless. But everyone who served under him knew the truth. This operation bore his fingerprints in every detail, from the initial intelligence analysis to the final positioning of forces. Years later, after the war, a historian interviewing Simonds asked him point-blank if the Scharnhorst operation had been motivated by Eisenhower's insulting comments. Simonds was silent for a long moment, then smiled that cold, predatory smile that his subordinates remembered from the planning sessions. "Let's just say," he replied, "that I have always believed in leading by example. If someone questions your capabilities, don't argue. Demonstrate." That philosophy became a cornerstone of post-war Canadian military doctrine. The emphasis on technical excellence, on meticulous planning, on proving capabilities through performance rather than rhetoric, all of these elements can be traced back to the lessons learned from the Boxing Day Massacre. Canadian officers who served in Korea, in peacekeeping operations and every subsequent conflict, carried with them the legacy of that frozen Arctic night when their predecessors proved that skill and determination could overcome any odds. The 36 German survivors of the Scharnhorst spent the remainder of the war in British prisoner-of-war camps. Several of them were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers trying to understand what had happened. Their accounts were remarkably consistent. The Scharnhorst had sailed into what appeared to be a standard convoy defense operation and found itself caught in a carefully orchestrated trap. The precision of the Allied tactics, the coordination between different national forces, and the ruthless efficiency of the final attack all pointed to a level of operational planning that had caught the Germans completely off guard. One survivor, a petty officer named Klaus Schmidt, described the final moments on board the sinking battlecruiser. He spoke of the terror as water rushed into compartments, of the darkness as electrical systems failed, of the screams of men trapped below decks as the ship rolled over. But he also spoke of something else. A kind of grudging respect for the forces that had destroyed them. "We thought we were facing an inferior opponent," Schmidt said in his interrogation. "We learned too late that we were facing executioners who had studied our every weakness." That word, executioners, captures something essential about what happened on Boxing Day 1943. This wasn't a conventional naval battle where two roughly equal forces clashed and one emerged victorious. This was a planned assassination of a warship, carried out with clinical precision by forces that had been underestimated and were determined to prove their worth through overwhelming demonstration of capability. The Arctic Ocean kept the Scharnhorst secrets for decades. The wreck wasn't located until 2000, lying in over 900 feet of water in almost perfect condition. Norwegian and British expedition teams that surveyed the wreck reported massive damage to the hull, with torpedo strikes and shell impacts concentrated in areas that would cause maximum damage to the ship's operational systems. It was, the expedition leader noted, exactly the kind of damage pattern you would expect from an opponent who knew precisely where to hit for maximum effect. When photographs of the wreck were published, De Wolf, then in his 90s, was shown the images. He studied them carefully, noting each damage point, comparing them to his memories of that night. Finally, he looked up at the interviewer and said simply, "We did what we set out to do. We proved that professional competence beats reputation every time." That statement could serve as the epitaph for the entire operation. The Scharnhorst had reputation. It had history. It had propaganda value and symbolic importance. But none of that protected it from Canadian destroyers that knew exactly where to strike, from British battleships that had been positioned with mathematical precision, from cruisers that had boxed in any escape routes. Reputation meant nothing against planning, skill, and the burning desire to prove doubters catastrophically wrong. The waves continue to roll over that Arctic grave today, cold and indifferent to the human drama that played out beneath them over 8 decades ago. The Scharnhorst rests in darkness, its guns silent, its decks empty, a testament to what happens when arrogance meets preparation. The Canadian sailors who fought that night are gone, their stories fading into history books and documentary footage. But what they accomplished endures. Every time a smaller nation stands up to a larger power, every time skill defeats assumption, every time meticulous planning overcomes brute force, the ghost of the Boxing Day Massacre is there. Eisenhower's dismissive words became the catalyst for one of the most brilliantly executed naval operations of the Second World War. His apology, sincere as it was, could never erase the fact that he had underestimated an entire nation's military capability based on prejudice rather than evidence. Simonds never spoke publicly about the operation again after that single historian's interview. He went to his grave keeping the full details of his planning process private, the intricate calculations and predictions that had made the ambush possible locked away in classified files that wouldn't be declassified for decades. But his subordinates knew. The officers who served under him, who watched him work through the night analyzing intelligence reports and plotting courses on maps, they understood that they had witnessed military genius at its finest. The lesson echoes through time with brutal clarity. Never underestimate an opponent. Never assume that historical dominance guarantees future success. Never mistake silence for weakness or restraint for inability. The Scharnhorst crew learned this lesson in the worst possible way, drowning in Arctic waters because their commanders had believed Allied intelligence reports that dismissed Canadian naval capabilities as negligible. On December 26 each year, a small ceremony is held at the Canadian Naval Memorial in Halifax. Veterans, when they were still alive, would gather to remember the Boxing Day Massacre. Now their children and grandchildren come, laying wreaths and standing in silence as the names of those who fought that night are read aloud. The ceremony is brief, understated, very Canadian in its refusal to boast or glorify. But everyone who attends understands what it represents. It represents the moment Canada stopped being a colony and became a power. The moment when Canadian military forces proved they could match any opponent on Earth when properly led and motivated. The moment when one general's refusal to accept an insult transformed into a tactical masterpiece that sent shockwaves through Allied and Axis command structures alike. Eisenhower went on to become President of the United States. Simonds became one of Canada's most decorated military leaders. De Wolf retired as a vice admiral, his name legendary in Canadian naval circles. The Scharnhorst became a grave for nearly 2,000 young Germans who never imagined their invincible battlecruiser could be cornered and destroyed with such methodical precision. History remembers December 26, 1943 as the day the Kriegsmarine lost one of its most powerful assets. But those who understand the deeper story know it was something more. It was the day that underestimation met its reckoning in the freezing darkness of the Arctic Ocean, and pride was paid for in blood, ice, and the eternal silence of the deep. That statement could serve as the epitaph for the entire operation. The Scharnhorst had reputation. It had history. It had propaganda value and symbolic importance. But none of that protected it from Canadian destroyers that knew exactly where to strike, from British battleships that had been positioned with mathematical precision, from cruisers that had boxed in any escape routes. Reputation meant nothing against planning, skill, and the burning desire to prove doubters catastrophically wrong. The waves continue to roll over that Arctic grave today, cold and indifferent to the human drama that played out beneath them over 8 decades ago. The Scharnhorst rests in darkness, its guns silent, its decks empty, a testament to what happens when arrogance meets preparation. The Canadian sailors who fought that night are gone, their stories fading into history books and documentary footage. But what they accomplished endures. Every time a smaller nation stands up to a larger power, every time skill defeats assumption, every time meticulous planning overcomes brute force, the ghost of the Boxing Day Massacre is there. Eisenhower's dismissive words became the catalyst for one of the most brilliantly executed naval operations of the Second World War. His apology, sincere as it was, could never erase the fact that he had underestimated an entire nation's military capability based on prejudice rather than evidence. Simonds never spoke publicly about the operation again after that single historian's interview. He went to his grave keeping the full details of his planning process private, the intricate calculations and predictions that had made the ambush possible locked away in classified files that wouldn't be declassified for decades. But his subordinates knew. The officers who served under him, who watched him work through the night analyzing intelligence reports and plotting courses on maps, they understood that they had witnessed military genius at its finest. The lesson echoes through time with brutal clarity. Never underestimate an opponent. Never assume that historical dominance guarantees future success. Never mistake silence for weakness or restraint for inability. The Scharnhorst crew learned this lesson in the worst possible way, drowning in Arctic waters because their commanders had believed Allied intelligence reports that dismissed Canadian naval capabilities as negligible. On December 26 each year, a small ceremony is held at the Canadian Naval Memorial in Halifax. Veterans, when they were still alive, would gather to remember the Boxing Day Massacre. Now their children and grandchildren come, laying wreaths and standing in silence as the names of those who fought that night are read aloud. The ceremony is brief, understated, very Canadian in its refusal to boast or glorify. But everyone who attends understands what it represents. It represents the moment Canada stopped being a colony and became a power. The moment when Canadian military forces proved they could match any opponent on Earth when properly led and motivated. The moment when one general's refusal to accept an insult transformed into a tactical masterpiece that sent shockwaves through Allied and Axis command structures alike. Eisenhower went on to become President of the United States. Simonds became one of Canada's most decorated military leaders. De Wolfe retired as a vice admiral, his name legendary in Canadian naval circles. The Scharnhorst became a grave for nearly 2,000 young Germans who never imagined their invincible battlecruiser could be cornered and destroyed with such methodical precision. History remembers December 26, 1943 as the day the Kriegsmarine lost one of its most powerful assets. But those who understand the deeper story know it was something more. It was the day that underestimation met its reckoning in the freezing darkness of the Arctic Ocean, and pride was paid for in blood, ice, and the eternal silence of the deep.